Bigfoot kills entire hunting party in Alaskan forest, 7 bodies found. That's the headline burned into every file, every whisper around campfires in Alaska. 7 seasoned hunters went in, men who knew the land, who carried rifles, who weren't afraid of anything, and yet not a single one made it out alive. It started like any other backcountry trip, a float plane drop, a gravel bar camp, nothing but trees, river, and silence. But then came the drumming in the distance, the oversized barefoot tracks pressed deep into the snow, and the feeling that something was circling them, waiting. When search teams finally went in weeks later, what they found was worse than anyone expected: torn camps, rifles abandoned, and 7 bodies scattered across the valley with no clear cause. Official reports blame accidents, but the evidence, the tape the hunters left behind, that tells another story. So the question is, what really stalked those men in Alaska's interior? And why did none of them survive to tell us? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. We've spent the last 6 months piecing together what happened to the Mitchell brothers in the fall of 1998. The case files from the Alaska State Troopers are extensive, but it's David Mitchell's testimony that forms the backbone of this account. I've cross-referenced his statements with physical evidence, search and rescue logs, and interviews with local hunters who knew the area. What emerges is a story that challenges everything I thought I understood about Alaska's interior wilderness. The Mitchell brothers, David, age 34, and Stephen, age 39, were fixtures in the Talkeetna hunting community. They'd grown up tracking moose and caribou with their father across the rugged terrain north of the Susitna River drainage, learning the land's rhythms long before they could drive. By 1998, they had 2 decades of successful hunting seasons behind them. Their reputation for woodcraft and level-headedness made them go-to guides for visiting hunters, and their expertise was regularly sought by search and rescue teams during emergency operations. They weren't the type to spook at shadows. Sarah Henderson, owner of the local hunting supply store, told me, "When David Mitchell tells you he saw something out there, you listen." Those boys knew the difference between a bear track and something that shouldn't exist. The region they chose for their fall hunt was remote, even by Alaskan standards, a sprawling wilderness of black spruce and tundra, approximately 70 miles north of Talkeetna. The nearest road ended 30 miles to the south. The landscape there is a maze of glacial valleys and weathered peaks, where autumn storms can trap you for days and satellite. Phones are often your only link to the outside world. I visited the area twice while researching this case. Even in good weather, the terrain is unforgiving. Thick alder thickets choke the valley floors, while the higher ground offers little shelter from the relentless wind. Game trails weave through stands of white birch and spruce, but they're often dead ends, leading to boggy clearings or rock faces that force you to backtrack for miles. The brothers had hunted this region before, usually flying in with bush pilot Pete Connolly, who'd been serving the area's hunters for 15 years. They were methodical, Connolly recalled during our interview. Always filed detailed flight plans, carried redundant emergency gear, left nothing to chance. That's what makes their story so damn unsettling. The weather records from that September show a stable high-pressure system had settled over the interior, bringing unusually clear skies and freezing nights. Perfect hunting conditions, according to David's initial statement. The brothers had spotted several bull moose from the air during their reconnaissance flight, and the cold snap had triggered the start of the rut when the males become more active and easier to track. Their base camp was established near a nameless creek at approximately 2,000 feet elevation, with good sight lines to several promising valleys. The site had served them well in previous seasons. They set up their main tent on a gravel bar, with a smaller shelter for their gear about 30 yards away. Standard procedure for experienced backcountry hunters, keeping food and scented items separate from sleeping quarters to avoid attracting bears. Everything felt normal those first 2 days, David told the troopers. The kind of normal you take for granted until it's gone. They'd seen fresh moose sign, set up a series of game cameras on likely travel corridors, and even caught glimpse of a large bull moving through a distant stand of spruce. The brothers had every reason to believe this would be another successful hunt, but something was off about the valley. David would later insist, little details that didn't add up. The absence of certain bird calls they'd always heard in previous years, the way their firewood would shift position overnight, despite careful stacking, and the tracks not moose or bear or wolf that appeared and disappeared in impossible places along the creek bed. You spend enough time in the bush, David said during our third interview, you develop a sense for when you're being watched, not by something natural, but by something that's thinking about what it's seeing. That's what we felt those first nights. We just didn't know what it meant yet. The Mitchell brothers, David, age 34, and Stephen, age 39, were fixtures in the Talkeetna hunting community. Their father had taught them to navigate Alaska's unforgiving wilderness since they could walk, and by 1998 they'd earned reputations as two of the most reliable guides in the region. Both men had weathered decades of harsh conditions, tracking everything from moose to mountain goats across terrain that would humble even experienced outdoorsmen. On September 23, 1998, they loaded their gear into a de Havilland beaver floatplane at Talkeetna's lakeside airport. The weather report promised 3 days of clear skies, a rare gift that late in the season. Their destination was a remote gravel bar along an unnamed tributary of the Susitna River, roughly 60 miles north of the nearest maintained trail. David later told me it was a spot they'd used as a base camp twice before, though not in the past 5 years. The flight in was routine. Stephen, who'd earned his pilot's license in 1985, guided the beaver between mountain peaks still capped with last winter's snow. Below them, the landscape transformed from dense spruce forest to a patchwork of autumn colors, gold birch leaves, crimson berry bushes, and the deep green of old-growth timber. David recorded their GPS coordinates in his weatherproof notebook, though both brothers knew the territory well enough to navigate by sight. They touched down on the river at 11:15 in the morning. The water was lower than they remembered, but the gravel bar offered plenty of space to beach the plane and establish camp. The brothers worked with practiced efficiency, securing the beaver with heavy stakes and unloading their gear to tents, dried food for 5 days, satellite phone, rifles, and enough emergency supplies to wait out any unexpected weather. The first thing that struck me, David wrote in his statement, was how quiet it was once we cut the engine. Just the sound of moving water and wind in the trees. No planes overhead, no distant machinery. We were properly alone out there. The isolation was exactly what they'd wanted. The nearest hunting party was likely 20 miles away, minimum. They'd chosen this spot specifically because it was off the regular circuit, requiring both bush pilot certification and intimate knowledge of the river system to access safely by 2 in the afternoon. Their camp was fully established. Two olive-drab tents stood 15 feet apart on the highest part of the gravel bar, well above the waterline. A basic kitchen area sat between them, protected from the wind by a tarp strung between dead-standing spruce. Their gear was methodically organized, everything in its place, everything accessible. This wasn't their first remote camp, and their attention to detail reflected years of experience. The air had that crisp edge typical of Alaskan autumn, hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Clouds moved fast overhead, their shadows racing across the valley walls. The brothers spent that first afternoon scouting the immediate area, marking game trails and noting promising routes up into the higher ground where they planned to hunt. "We found fresh moose tracks," David recalled, "and some older bear sign, but nothing unusual. The land felt normal, healthy, just a regular piece of Alaskan wilderness doing what it's supposed to do." They turned in early that night, planning to start their hunt proper at first light. The river's constant murmur provided familiar background noise, and the evening settling of the forester calls of late-season birds. The rustle of small animals in the brush was exactly what they expected. Everything was proceeding according to plan, following patterns they'd established over decades of similar trips. Looking back at the case files now, what strikes me is the thoroughness of their preparation. These weren't amateurs pushing their luck or thrill-seekers testing their limits. The Mitchell brothers were professionals who understood and respected the wilderness. Their gear was appropriate, their planning meticulous, their location well-researched. They had every reason to feel confident about the days ahead. I've spent months piecing together what happened during those fateful September days in 1998. Through interviews with Stephen Mitchell, the surviving brother, and careful review of search and rescue records, weather data, and recovered equipment, I've assembled this account. What follows is as accurate a reconstruction as possible, drawn primarily from Stephen's detailed statements and the physical evidence left behind. The brothers' first full day of hunting began at first light on September 15th. The weather was clear but cool, typical for that time of year in the Alaska Range's northern reaches. They'd established their base camp on a wide gravel bar beside the unnamed tributary, the kind of spot seasoned bush pilots favor, open enough for emergency takeoffs, elevated enough to avoid flash floods, and sheltered enough to break the worst of the wind. Stephen recalled how they divided their hunting zones that morning. Working in a practice tandem they'd refined over 20 years of shared expeditions. David would work the eastern drainage, while Stephen took the western slopes, planning to converge back at camp by late afternoon. The terrain was challenging, but not exceptional by their standards, a mix of black spruce stands, boggy clearings, and rocky outcrops that required careful navigation. What struck both brothers immediately, according to Stephen's account, was the unusual quiet. The small game was just gone, he told me during our third interview session. No squirrels chattering, no ptarmigan flushing from the brush. Even the ravens were scarce. They'd hunted this general region before, and while wildlife populations naturally fluctuate, the absence felt wrong somehow. Their primary quarry bull, moose, proved equally elusive. Stephen spotted fresh tracks in several promising locations. Muddy wallows, stands of willow where the branches showed recent browsing. But the animals themselves remained frustratingly out of reach. David's radio updates throughout the day reported similar results on his side of the valley. They covered nearly 15 miles each that first day. According to Stephen's GPS logs, the weather held steady high clouds, temperatures in the low 40s Fahrenheit, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes down. perfect hunting conditions, which made their lack of success all the more puzzling. It was during their evening meal, as they compared notes over freeze-dried stew, that they first heard it. Stephen's description was precise, a deep, rhythmic sound like someone slowly beating a bass drum, but muffled by distance. Maybe 4 or 5 beats, evenly spaced, then silence. David suggested it might be rockfall from the ridges above them, or perhaps distant thunder, though the sky remained clear. The sound came again perhaps 20 minutes later, seemingly from a different direction, but with the same measured cadence. We'd both heard plenty of natural sounds in the backcountry, Stephen explained, but this was different, not quite right. Still, we didn't make much of it at the time. They noted it in their hunting log's standard practice for tracking weather events or unusual observations and turned in early, planning another pre-dawn start. The gravel bar fell quiet as darkness settled in. Their tent was positioned between 2 massive drift logs, offering additional wind protection and a solid backdrop that would reflect their campfire's heat. The river's constant murmur provided familiar white noise, the kind of sound that usually lulled experienced outdoorsmen to sleep. But Stephen remembered lying awake longer than usual that first night, listening. Not for the drumming that had stopped completely after those 2 instances, but for the normal sounds of the wilderness, the small rustlings and calls that should have filled the darkness. Those sounds never came. The silence, broken only by the river and the occasional crackle of their dying fire, stretched on until sleep finally took him. In reviewing the physical evidence, one of the most intriguing items is David Mitchell's leather-bound hunting journal. The entry for September 16th, 1998, stands out not just for its content, but for the uncharacteristically hurried handwriting. I've studied this document extensively, and what follows combines the journal's details with Stephen's later testimony about that day's events. The morning began much like the previous one, with the brothers splitting up to cover more ground. The weather had shifted slightly. Stephen recalled a light drizzle that lasted until around 10 in the morning, leaving everything damp and the tracking conditions ideal. It was David who made the first unusual discovery, according to his journal. Entry time-stamped at 11:15 a.m. He had been following a promising game trail that paralleled a small tributary stream when he noticed something odd in the mud. The entry reads, "Found unusual tracks by the creek bend. Initially thought moose, but configuration all wrong. Appears to be barefoot impressions, much larger than any human foot. Measured roughly 19 inches from heel to toe. Stride length, approximately 58 inches between clearest prints." David's background in forestry lent weight to his observations. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail. The journal continues. Depth and displacement suggest significant weight. Could be bare forepaw prints distorted by water flow, but lack characteristic claw marks. Took photos with the Nikon. Will develop when back in town. Those photos, unfortunately, were never recovered. Stephen remembers David radioing him about the discovery around noon. He was trying to sound matter-of-fact about it, Stephen told me, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. David wasn't one to jump to conclusions, and he definitely wasn't the type to get spooked by tracks. But something about these had him rattled. They met back at camp earlier than usual that afternoon to examine the site together. The rain had resumed by then, and the prints were already deteriorating. Still, enough remained for Stephen to confirm his brother's measurements. In his own words, we'd seen every kind of track Alaska can produce. Bear, moose, caribou, name it. These weren't any of those. The shape was too human-like, but the size was impossible. They spent over an hour documenting what remained of the prints, taking measurements and sketching in David's journal. They discussed various explanations: a bear walking in its own tracks, multiple overlapping prints, or water erosion distorting normal animal signs. None quite fit what they were seeing. The brothers made camp that evening, about half a mile from the print site, choosing a small clearing backed by dense spruce. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds remained, bringing an early darkness. They had just finished their evening meal when the knocking began. David's journal describes it as distinct wood-on-wood impacts, 3 to 4 seconds apart, moving from northeast to northwest. Stephen's memory matches this account. It sounded exactly like someone taking two pieces of hardwood and striking them together. Not like branches breaking in the wind, this had rhythm to it. The sounds continued intermittently for about 20 minutes. Both men initially tried to rationalize it as natural forest sounds, dead trees creaking, branches giving way under accumulated moisture. But the regularity of the impacts and the way they seemed to shift position defied easy explanation. The journal's final entry for that day reads, "Knocking stopped at approximately 20 to 30 hours. No other unusual activity. We'll investigate source tomorrow if weather permits." Steve suggests moving camp closer to the gravel bar might not be a bad idea. Stephen would later tell me that they spent much of that night in uncomfortable silence. Listening, the familiar night sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the wildlife around them was lying low. Even the constant background noise of the river felt somehow different, more isolating than comforting. The morning of September 19th brought a disturbing shift in the situation. I've cross-referenced the recovered journal entries with Stephen's testimony to piece together the escalating events of that fourth day. The brothers woke at first light to find their carefully stored food cache had been ransacked during the night. These weren't the typical signs of bears or smaller scavengers. The heavy dry bags had been deliberately untied rather than torn, their contents selectively picked through. Most unsettling was how their dehydrated meals and energy bars were gone, while the fresh meat from their recent kills remained untouched. It wasn't random animal damage, Stephen explained during our interview. Whatever got into our supplies knew how to work the knots, and the way things were sorted, it felt deliberate, almost methodical. David's journal entry that morning reflects their growing unease. Zero sign of bears, no claw marks, no scattered garbage. Someone or something went through our things with purpose. Distance from camp suggests it happened while we were asleep. No tracks due to frozen ground, but found broken branches on trail leading northeast. They spent the morning reorganizing their supplies and reinforcing the camp's security. Around noon, they discovered their fire pit had been disturbed and simply scattered, but systematically dismantled. The carefully stacked rocks had been arranged in what David's notes describe as an obviously intentional pattern. Stephen later clarified, the stones were laid out in a rough circle, maybe 15 feet from where we'd built the fire. Not scattered like an animal would do, but placed. The incident that truly shook their composure occurred shortly before dusk. David was checking their perimeter while Stephen cleaned their rifles. The journal records what happened next in David's characteristically precise manner. 1700 hours. Movement spotted approximately 70 yards out, northwest edge of clearing. Initial impression, upright figure, estimated height 8 to 9 feet. Dark coloration, visible for 3 to 4 seconds before moving behind spruce. stand, too fluid for bear, too large for moose, unable to pursue due to failing light. Stephen remembers his brother's return to camp. David's face was white as paper. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but whatever he'd seen had him properly spooked. That's when the first real cracks started showing. The evening brought tension to their previously easy dynamic. David insisted on documenting his sighting in detail, while Stephen initially tried to lighten the mood with jokes about mountain giants. But the attempted humor fell flat as the forest around them grew unusually quiet. I stopped the giant comments pretty quick, Stephen admitted. Something about David's reaction, he wasn't playing around. And once the sun set, well, the woods felt different, like we were being watched. The journal's final entry for that day reveals their eroding confidence. 2100 hours. No further visual contact. Steve suggested moving camp tomorrow. Agreed. We'll relocate closer to landing zone. Remaining food secured in plane. Taking alternate watch shifts tonight. Weather clear, temperature dropping. Notable absence of normal, nocturnal sounds. They maintained their watch rotation until dawn, though neither man slept much. The night passed without incident, but Stephen described an oppressive silence that seemed to press in around their camp. The usual chorus of insects and night birds was conspicuously absent, replaced by what he called a waiting kind of quiet. Looking back at the evidence, this day marks a clear turning point. The systematic disturbance of their camp, David's sighting, and the unnatural silence of the forest created the first serious cracks in these experienced outdoorsmen's composure. Their decades of wilderness experience no longer seemed adequate preparation for what they were facing. The morning after the disturbing discoveries at camp, I found detailed notes about what the brothers encountered while checking their game. Trails, according to Stephen's testimony, they'd set out early, hoping to salvage their hunting trip despite the previous day's unsettling events. About 2 miles from camp, they came across something that stopped them in their tracks. Along one of the well-worn game trails, they discovered what David's journal describes as engineered structures. These weren't the random tangles of fallen timber you'd expect in the wilderness. Instead, they found young spruce saplings deliberately woven together, creating crude but unmistakably intentional arch-like formations over the trail. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just storm damage, Stephen told me during our interview. But these weren't broken or bent. They were carefully twisted together, some of them still living. The precision of it, someone or something, had taken time to construct these. The brothers documented 3 distinct structures spaced roughly 50 yards apart. Each stood approximately 8 feet tall, with smaller branches meticulously interwoven to create what David's notes called doorway-like passages along the game trail. The craftsmanship was crude but purposeful. Their initial reaction was to blame it on human interference. Maybe some local kids came out here to mess with hunters, Stephen remembered suggesting, or trappers marking their territory. But David, ever the methodical one, quickly dismissed these possibilities. His journal entry details their reasoning. No sign of human traffic. Ground too hard for footprints, but no machine tracks, either no ATV trails, no snowmobile marks from previous seasons. Nearest road is 38 miles southeast. Nearest settlement, 60 plus miles. Float plane access only, and we've seen no other aircraft. The realization of their isolation hit them hard at that moment. Stephen's voice grew quiet when describing it. We knew we were remote, but somehow those structures made us feel it differently, like we were trespassing somewhere we shouldn't be. They spent nearly an hour examining the area, taking measurements and searching for any signs that might explain the structure's origin. David meticulously sketched the formations in his journal, noting how the weaving pattern appeared too complex for natural causes, but too primitive for modern human construction. The longer we stood there, Stephen recalled, the more wrong it felt. The forest had that same unnatural quiet from the night before. No birds, no squirrels, just silence and those twisted trees staring back at us. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just some local kids messing around, Stephen told me during our interview. But the more we looked at these structures, the less sense that made. The formations stood roughly 8 feet tall, with smaller saplings meticulously interwoven at precise angles. What troubled them most was the fresh nature of the construction. The broken ends of branches still showed green wood, and disturbed moss hadn't yet begun to regrow. David, always the more analytical of the brothers, took measurements and photographs. His recovered journal contains detailed sketches, showing how the saplings had been twisted and knotted together without tools or rope. The strength required to manipulate 4-inch thick saplings this way would have been considerable. More disturbing was the complete absence of human tracks, boot prints, or TV marks in the surrounding soil. We're 40 miles from the nearest road, Mark had pointed out. No teenagers are hiking out here just to build weird stick art. As dusk approached, the group gathered around their campfire, the usual easy banter replaced by tense speculation. I've interviewed enough hunters and outdoorsmen to know when bravado masks genuine concern. These were experienced men, well-versed in Alaska's wilderness, yet something about those structures had shaken their confidence. John, the youngest of the group at 32 years old, was the first to voice what others had been thinking. Can't shake the feeling we're being watched, he admitted, poking at the fire with a stick. Been feeling it since yesterday, like eyes on the back of my neck. The others might have dismissed this as rookie nerves, but at that moment, a sound cut through the darkness. Stephen described it as a long, drawn-out wailing, not the familiar howl of a wolf pack or a moose's bellow, but something that seemed to carry unnaturally across the valley. The sound repeated 3 times, each call lasting nearly 30 seconds. Never heard anything like it, Stephen recalled, his voice still tense years later. It was wrong. Too controlled for an animal, too powerful for a person. Even Pete, their most experienced hunter with 25 years in Alaska's backcountry, couldn't identify the source. The wails echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to pinpoint their origin. The men sat in silence, their fire suddenly seeming very small against the vast darkness beyond their camp. Interviewed Stephen multiple times about what happened the following morning. A light snow had fallen overnight, unusual for early September, but not unheard of at those elevations. As the group emerged from their tents, they immediately noticed the tracks. They were pressed deep into the fresh powder, Stephen recalled, his voice tight. Bipedal prints, like a person walking, except they were 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches across at the ball of the foot. The stride length was close to 6 feet. David, ever methodical, photographed the tracks with his disposable camera and placed his own boot next to them for scale. His size 12 boot looked child-sized in comparison. The prints showed clear toe impressions and a distinct arch, nothing like the round pad marks of a bear's plantigrade feet. The discovery sparked heated debate around the camp. Pete, who had guided in these mountains for over 2 decades, insisted they should break camp immediately. "Something's not right here," he kept saying. "This isn't normal wildlife behavior. but John and Mark argued against leaving. They were 40 miles from their extraction point, and the float plane wasn't due for another 3 days. "We've got rifles," Mark reasoned. "Whatever it is, we can handle it." I noticed during my interviews that this moment marked a shift in how the men carried themselves. Their hunting rifles, previously slung casually over shoulders or leaned against trees, became constant companions. Even basic tasks like gathering firewood or checking their game cameras now required armed escorts. "We were all experienced hunters," Stephen explained. "But those tracks, they changed something. We started moving in pairs, watching the tree line. The woods didn't feel like woods anymore. They felt like someone else's territory." The argument about leaving continued throughout the morning. Pride and practicality wrestling with growing unease. In the end, distance and logistics won out. They stayed. I've spent months piecing together what happened that evening through interviews, journal entries, and the official reports. The events I'm about to share come primarily from Stephen's testimony, corroborated by items recovered from the campsite. Around 7:30 that evening, as the group huddled near their fire pit preparing dinner, an unfamiliar odor drifted through their camp. Stephen described it as sour, like rotting vegetation mixed with wet fur, but somehow muskier at first. They assumed it was carrion somewhere upwind, but the smell seemed to move, shifting position around their perimeter. "We'd dealt with bears before," Stephen told me, his voice tight during our interview. "This wasn't that. Bears smelled different. This was something else entirely." David, always the practical one, suggested they light their backup lantern for better visibility. As they positioned the second light, movement caught their attention just beyond the tree line. Through the gathering darkness, they glimpsed what Stephen described as impossibly broad shoulders moving behind the trees, perhaps 40 yards out. The figure withdrew swiftly, but not in panic. The movement was deliberate, controlled, whatever it was, Stephen recalled. It moved like it knew exactly what it was doing. Not like an animal startled by our lights. This thing, it was studying us. The group's dynamics shifted dramatically after that sighting. I found notes in David's recovered journal describing heated arguments about their next steps. Some wanted to break camp immediately, despite the approaching darkness. Others, including Mark, insisted they were armed and capable of handling any wildlife threat. But their bravado was clearly crumbling. "We kept our rifles closer after that," Stephen admitted, "not just for hunting anymore. We started taking watches at night, something we'd never done before. The thing is, we all knew whatever was out there. It wasn't just passing through. It was watching us, learning our patterns. The most unsettling aspect, according to multiple testimonies, was the growing sense of intelligence behind the encounters. The creatures seemed to understand their light sources, staying just beyond their effective range. It would appear briefly in one spot, then be heard moving through the brush from an entirely different direction. You don't get that kind of behavior from normal wildlife, Stephen emphasized. This wasn't just an animal following instinct. It was thinking, planning, and that's what really started to get to us. We weren't just being watched, we were being studied. I spent considerable time examining the journal entries from those final days. The neat, measured handwriting from earlier pages deteriorated noticeably, reflecting the group's mounting anxiety. David's typically organized notes became hurried, some entries crammed into margins or written at odd angles across the paper. October 7th, 3 a.m., one entry read, "Something circled, camp again. Closer this time." Mark swears he saw eyes reflecting our fire from two different positions simultaneously. Not possible unless there's more than one. Nobody's sleeping well anymore. The next entry, dated October 8th, showed signs of being ridden with a shaking hand, keeping the fire too high, burning through our wood too fast. Can't help it. The darkness feels wrong. Stevens thinks they're trying to wear us down. Starting to agree. What struck me most was how their technical observations began mixing with raw emotional responses. A detailed note about track measurements would be followed by underlined warnings. Don't let the fire die or watch the trees. These weren't the writings of men simply spooked by wilderness sounds. These were experienced outdoorsmen documenting something that had shattered their understanding of what was possible. The final journal entry, recovered from their scattered camp equipment, was dated October 9th. The writing was almost frantic, but still legible. Left taped message in bottom of blue gear bag. If anyone finds this, believe what's on it. Not making this up. Not crazy. They're real. They're intelligent. And they're not just watching. Anymore. There the entry ends mid-sentence. Below it, in different handwriting I later confirmed as Mark's, was a single line. Voice recorder in blue bag has everything. God help us. When I interviewed the search and rescue team that eventually found their campsite, they confirmed discovering a small tape recorder wrapped in a waterproof bag. Unfortunately, by the time it was recovered, exposure to the elements had damaged the tape beyond salvation. Whatever message they felt compelled to leave, whatever evidence they thought they'd captured, was lost. The journal's deterioration from methodical hunting notes to desperate warnings tells its own story. These weren't men prone to paranoia or exaggeration. Something had systematically broken down their confidence, their sense of security, and ultimately, their grasp on what they thought was possible in those remote woods. I continued poring over the final entries in the recovered journal. The last dated note was particularly disturbing, written in a desperate scrawl across 2 pages. October 9th, left message on Mark's tape recorder, hidden in blue gear bag. If anyone finds this, the writing trailed off there, the pen marking dragging into an unsteady line, when the hunters failed to make their scheduled extraction date of October 15th. Concerns were immediately raised. Jack Thompson, the float plane pilot who had dropped them off, reported to authorities that he'd arrived at the designated pickup point but found no sign of the men. After circling the area for 2 hours and seeing no emergency signals, he was forced to return due to deteriorating weather conditions. The Alaska State Troopers launched a search and rescue operation on October 16th, but early winter storms delayed their efforts for 3 crucial days. When the weather finally cleared enough for ground teams to reach the site, what they found painted a haunting picture of the hunters' final days. The camp was in complete disarray. Their main tent had been torn apart, with long rips in the heavy duty. Fabric that search team leader Sarah Martinez noted appeared to be from something pulling, not cutting. The smaller sleeping tent lay crumpled and partially dragged into the tree line. Its aluminum poles bent at unnatural angles. Their supplies were scattered across a 50-yard radius. Cooking equipment, food containers, and personal items littered the ground as if thrown in multiple directions. Most disturbing was the discovery of all 3 of their high-powered hunting rifles, found propped carefully against a tree rather than taken with them. The weapons were fully loaded, unfired, with no signs of malfunction. The fire pit told its own story. Rather than the controlled burn area typical of experienced outdoorsmen, the ashes suggested massive fires had been maintained. with charred logs radiating out several feet from the main circle. The amount of burned wood far exceeded what would be necessary for normal camping needs. Martinez's initial report noted, the scene suggests a hasty departure under duress, but contradictory evidence makes it difficult to determine exactly what occurred. The careful placement of the rifles indicates this wasn't a sudden flight from a predator, yet the camp's condition suggests violence or panic. We found no blood or signs of conventional animal attack, and no indication of where the subjects when after leaving the immediate area. The search expanded over the following weeks, hampered by early snowfall and dangerous conditions. Despite extensive ground and aerial surveys, no trace of the hunters was found beyond their devastated campsite. I was part of the secondary search team that made the first grim discovery on October 23rd. 7 days into the operation, the morning had started clear but cold, with temperatures hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. We were working a grid pattern about a mile northeast of the camp when Officer Chen called out. What we found was James Miller's body, partially concealed under a fallen spruce. He lay on his side, arms raised in what our forensics team would later determine was a defensive position. Even through my years of search and rescue experience, this scene was different. The injuries weren't consistent with any wildlife attack I'd encountered before. No bite marks, Chen noted, photographing the scene. No claw patterns either. She was right. The damage appeared to be from massive blunt force trauma, as if James had been struck repeatedly by something with tremendous power, but no sharp edges. The ground around the body showed signs of a violent struggle with broken branches and disturbed earth. But what caught my attention was the lack of tracks leading to or from the scene. The soil was soft enough that any large predator should have left clear impressions. Yet we found nothing beyond James's own boot prints and some scattered, partial marks that our tracking expert couldn't definitively identify. 2 days later, we located Thomas Reed's remains approximately 0.4 miles further northeast. The position of his body told a similar story: defensive wounds, signs of a powerful impact, but again, no traditional predator markers. The scene had the same puzzling lack of tracks. Despite the favorable conditions for preserving prints, the most unsettling discovery came 3 days after that. We found David Cooper's body in a small clearing 0.6 miles from Thomas. Unlike the others, David appeared to have died while running. His body showed evidence of multiple impacts, primarily to his back and shoulders. Our forensics team estimated he'd covered significant distance at high speed before the final confrontation. What troubled me most was the pattern of injury across all 3 victims. Dr. Sarah Martinez, our lead forensic investigator, pointed out an important detail during her preliminary examination. These injuries suggest they were struck by something with tremendous force, but the impact patterns are uniform, like being hit with a solid object rather than claws or teeth. In my 15 years of working wilderness fatalities, I've never seen anything quite like this. The spacing of the bodies created another mystery. They were found roughly along a straight line leading away from their camp, separated by distances. That suggested they'd fled in the same direction but at different times. Yet we couldn't find any evidence of them being dragged or transported. Each appeared to have fallen where we found them. I remember standing at the last scene, looking back toward the direction of their camp. The terrain between the points where we found each man was rough, with dense undergrowth and numerous obstacles. Any predator pursuing them would have left a trail of broken vegetation and tracks, but we found no such evidence. It was as if whatever had caused their deaths had moved through the forest without touching the ground. The official report would later cite unknown causes and possible wildlife encounter. But those of us who worked the scene knew this wasn't a typical animal attack. The physical evidence simply didn't add up. No predator marks, no drag patterns, no tracks, and trauma inconsistent with any known Alaska wildlife. The recovered tape recorder mentioned in their final journal entry was never found. Despite our thorough search of the camp and surrounding area, whatever message they had tried to leave died with them in those woods. The case remains open, classified as an unsolved wilderness death, but those of us who worked it still discuss the inexplicable details, the precision of the injuries, the calculated spacing of the bodies, and most importantly, the complete absence of predator evidence continue to defy conventional explanation. I've spent 23 years in search and rescue, and I've never seen a case file get buried as quickly as this one. The official report reads like a template: accident in remote conditions, probable wildlife encounter, clean, simple, case closed. But I know better. I was there when State Trooper Mike Callahan pulled me aside, away from the other team members. It was 3 days after we'd finished recovering the bodies. We were at the ranger station, finishing paperwork, when Mike gestured for me to follow him outside. The October air was bitter cold, and fresh snow had started falling. "Listen," he said, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "There's something that didn't make it into the official report, something I found near the second victim's location." He pulled out his personal notebook, flipping to a page with detailed sketches and measurements. These prints were preserved in a patch of snow about 15 yards from Thomas Reed's body. I've worked wildlife cases for 16 years, tracked every predator in these mountains. These match nothing in our database. The drawing showed a clearly defined bipedal print, nearly 19 inches in length. The depth and displacement patterns suggested something of immense weight, but the stride length and gait were unnervingly human-like. "Why isn't this in the report?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mike shook his head. "I tried, took photos, made casts. My superior took one look and said, including it would compromise the integrity of the investigation. The photos disappeared from my camera the next day. The plaster casts never made it to evidence. Over the next few months, I heard similar whispers from other SAR team members. Chen mentioned finding unusual hair samples that were never properly analyzed. Martinez, our forensics expert, confided that her initial report detailing the inconsistencies in the injury patterns was rejected, and she was asked to submit a more conventional analysis. The case began circulating in SAR circles, discussed in hushed tones during shift changes or over late-night coffee. Other teams started coming forward with similar stories: unexplained prints, strange injuries, evidence that vanished. All from the same region, all officially attributed to bear attacks or wilderness accidents. What haunts me most is what Trooper Callahan told me just before he transferred out of state last year. Those prints, he said, they were fresh. Whatever made them was still in the area when we were conducting the search. And here's the thing, they showed clear direction changes. Purpose. Whatever it was watching us search. The official narrative remains unchanged. The hunters' deaths are listed as a tragic accident, another cautionary tale about the dangers of Alaska's wilderness. But those of us who worked the scene know different. We remember the inexplicable evidence, the contradictions, the silence. From above, I still have a copy of Mike's sketches, carefully hidden away. Sometimes I take them out, studying the measurements, the distinctive pressure points, the clear indicators of bipedal movement. They tell a different story than the official reports, one of something intelligent, powerful and unknown, still roaming those remote valleys. The truth about what happened to those hunters remains, buried somewhere between official denials and whispered conversations. But one thing is certain: whatever stalked them through those woods wasn't any bear I've ever known. And sometimes, on cold nights, when the wind howls down from the north, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting for the next group of hunters to venture too far into its territory. The case remains officially closed. But for those of us who know what we saw, who handled the evidence that disappeared, the questions never stop. We just learned to keep them to ourselves, sharing them only with others who've seen similar things in the deep woods, where the official reports don't match the reality on the ground. I sat across from James Reed, the sole surviving brother, in his modest Anchorage home. The box of recovered items from the camp sat between us on his kitchen table, untouched for nearly 25 years. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. "I couldn't bring myself to go through these before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The state troopers gave me everything they found." But he trailed off, pulling out a weathered leather journal. The journal belonged to his brother Thomas, the eldest of the 3 Reed brothers who had ventured into those remote woods. The pages were warped from exposure, but the writing remained legible. James opened it carefully, as if handling a sacred text. "October 12th, 1998, he read aloud, then paused to steady his voice. "Mike swears he saw something. Watching camp today. Says it was too tall for a bear. Moved to smooth." David laughed it off, but I'm not so sure anymore. The knocking sounds are getting closer each night. He turned several pages, scanning entries that grew increasingly urgent. "October 14th. Found our food cache completely destroyed. Not scattered like a bear would do. Methodically pulled apart. David finally admitted something's not right. We're keeping the rifles closer now." The final entry was dated October 16th, just 2 days before the search began. The handwriting was noticeably different, hurried, almost frantic. "Whatever's out here, it's not just watching anymore. It's trying to push us out. Found those branch structures again, bigger this time, right at the edge of our camp. Mike wanted to leave, but the weather's turned. We're stuck until the entry." Ended mid-sentence. James set the journal aside and reached deeper into the box, pulling out an old cassette recorder. "The troopers mentioned they found this," he said, "but I couldn't. I watched as he pressed play." Static crackled through the small speaker, then voices emerged, 3 men talking in low, tense tones. The audio quality was poor, degraded by time and the elements, but the fear in their voices cut through clearly. "Third time tonight." "Did you hear it?" one voice asked. "She. There, that sound." Another voice, presumably Mike's, was cut off by a deep, rhythmic thumping in the background. "Jesus Christ, it's closer than before." This voice was shaking. "We need to. Something out here doesn't want us." The words came through, crystal clear, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps approaching the recorder. Then silence, absolute and abrupt. James stopped the tape, his face ashen. That was Thomas. That last voice, that was my brother. He slumped in his chair, eyes fixed on the recorder. They knew something was hunting them. They knew, and they couldn't. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, an October wind rattled the windows, carrying the first hints of winter. Finally, James spoke again, his voice hollow. The official report says it was a bear attack. Simple, clean explanation. But bears don't stack branches into structures. Bears don't knock on trees in patterns. Bears don't— He gestured at the journal, the tape recorder, all the physical remnants of his brother's final days. Bears don't hunt methodically, strategically, like this thing did. He carefully repacked the box, but kept the journal and tape recorder out. These tell the real story, he said. Not what they put in the reports, not what they told the papers. These are their words, their voices, their fear. Whatever happened up there, whatever took my brothers, it knew exactly what it was doing. The tape recorder sat between us, a silent witness to unspoken horrors. In it, preserved despite time and elements, were the last known words of 3 experienced hunters who ventured into the Alaskan wilderness and found something that defied explanation. Something that, as Thomas Reed said in those final moments, didn't want them there. As I drove back from James Reed's house that evening, the October darkness settled over Anchorage like a heavy blanket. The box of evidence sat in my passenger seat, a collection of fragments that told only part of a story that would never be fully known. I've spent 20 years investigating disappearances in Alaska's wilderness. The Reed brothers' case haunts me more than most, not for its violence, but for its deliberate nature. The precision in those final days, the strategic harassment, the methodical dismantling of their security, the calculated pressure that drove experienced outdoorsmen to panic speaks to something beyond mere animal behavior. The vastness of Alaska's interior holds many secrets. North of the Susitna River drainage, where the Reed brothers made their final camp, lies millions of acres of untamed wilderness, valleys that have never known human footsteps, forests that have stood undisturbed since the last ice age, places where the silence runs so deep it feels alive. I've interviewed hundreds of hunters, trappers, and bush pilots over the years. Many laugh off stories of strange encounters, attributing them to imagination or misidentification. But there are others, veteran outdoorsmen like the Reeds, whose experiences can't be so easily dismissed. They speak of territories where they feel unwelcome, of ancient pathways marked by twisted branches, of sounds that shouldn't exist in nature. The official reports will always list the Reed brothers as victims of a bear attack. It's neater that way, fitting into recognized patterns of wilderness fatality. But the evidence tells a different story. The strategic dismantling of their camp, the defensive wounds inconsistent with bear attacks, the prints that matched no known species, and most tellingly, their own documented descent from confidence to terror. Their final tape recording sits in my desk drawer now, a reminder that some mysteries resist resolution. The fear in Thomas Reed's last words, "Something out here doesn't want us," carries a warning that extends beyond their tragic encounter. It suggests a hierarchy in the wilderness that we've forgotten or chosen to ignore. Alaska's wilderness is not empty. It is not simply a backdrop for human adventure or resource extraction. It is a living entity layered with histories we can barely comprehend, populated by creatures we haven't fully documented. Some territories may belong to something older than our understanding, something that views human intrusion not with mindless aggression but with territorial intelligence. The Reed brothers' case remains officially closed, but its implications echo through every disappearance I've investigated since. Their experience serves as a subtle but firm reminder. Respect the silence of wild places. Not every corner of this vast land welcomes human presence. Some territories are not ours to claim. The truth of what happened to the Reed brothers lies somewhere between their fragmentary evidence and the endless wilderness that claimed them. Like so many Alaska mysteries, it remains suspended in that uncertain space where explanation fails and wonder or terror begins. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.